Good morning. It's exciting to see so many people joining us today for a discussion on sustainable agriculture. I'm Charlton Hook, co-chair of the Social Enterprise Conference, Capital for Good, co-president of Microlumbia, and an MBA student for Columbia Business School. All of us are impacted daily by the global agricultural system. This essential industry is filled with complexity and impacts our world in many unconsidered ways. Today, we will hear from Sara Tjossem, Scott Weathers, and Kaushik Kappagantulu about some of those challenges the agricultural system faces and solutions that people are using. Kaushik has spent the last 11 years building scalable social enterprises serving India's rural poor. He is the co-founder and CEO of Kheyti, an organization helping smallholder farmers battle climate change through its Greenhouse in a Box, a low-cost greenhouse bundled with end-to-end services that protects crops from environmental risks and grows 7 times more food using 90% less water, all the while helping farmers achieve a steadier income of $100 a month. Before Kheyti, Kaushik spent 5 years as a leadership team member of Be Able, scaling its training centers to 200 centers across 14 states, training more than 70,000 school dropouts yearly. He is a graduate of IIT Kharagpur and has an MBA from Columbia Business School. Kaushik is an Acumen India Fellow, 2014, and a DRK Foundation entrepreneur. Scott leads the Good Food Institute's state-level political strategy, working to level the playing field for cultivated and plant-based meats, dairies, and eggs. He came to GFI from Compassion in World Farming USA, where he was a strategic partnerships manager, establishing CIWF's first ever program focused on plant-based protein. Scott's work has appeared in the New York Times, The Guardian, Vox, Now This, Civil Eats, and more. He holds a Master of Science from Harvard Chan School of Public Health. Sara is a senior lecturer at SIPA's Master Program of Public Administration in Environmental Sciences and Policy. The program's associate director of curriculum as well. Her teaching and research interests on the intersection of science and society, the history of science, agriculture, marine science, and the development of environmental movements and policy. Sara is also a published author, writing the book, The Journey to Pisces, Scientific Cooperation in the North Pacific, has many other publications, including Scientific Cooperation in the North Pacific, the Pisces Project, Multilateralism in International Ocean Resource Law, along with several reviews of history of science books and articles. Tjossem at the University of Minnesota was the assistant director of the Institute of Social, Economic, and Ecological Sustainability, as well as a professor. She also served as a lecturer and capstone instructor at the University of Washington, Seattle. And with that, I'll pass it off to you, Sara.
Great, thanks very much, Charlton. Well, we're looking forward to a great panel today because we have two dynamic people who are really fundamental to this new wave of concern about how food is produced and also how it's consumed. And so it's nice to have this two ends of the spectrum to talk. So just a forewarning that I am not a business school person. I come from history, and one of my real interest is in how people adopt new ways of thinking about producing food, for instance, and consuming food. And so some of the questions I'll ask you will have to do about the role of technology. So just a forewarning that I'll favor the historical perspective. So I'd like to start just with Kaushik K. That's how he will appear on LinkedIn for those of you who want to check out his profile. And Scott Weathers will appear as Scott Weathers. But I'd like each of you to answer the open-ended question of how did you get to where you are now? So what motivates you in the field of food and agriculture? Kaushik?
Great. Yeah. Thank you, Sarah. And thank you to everyone for calling me back here. I was just mentioning to Sarah and Scott, it's sort of, I never thought this would happen so soon, because 4 years ago, I was at probably the Social Enterprise Conference in person when I was in business school, and I was the VP of events of the Social Enterprise Club. So, was really looking forward to having that in my life. But then I shifted to India, and my life was mostly never going to come back to New York during this specific time. So I think the one silver lining in the pandemic is that I get to come back and hopefully share some of my journey of those, last 11 years in impact, but also the last 4 years in sustainable agriculture. So I'm very grateful for that. So thanks for organizing this. So yeah, so my perspective of how I came to sustainable agriculture is, it starts and ends with the rural Indian farmers. So I graduated college. I was an engineer. Didn't know anything about agriculture or rural India. I was a city kid. But basically, through a sequence of events, I started working in rural India and really understood that there's so much there's obviously challenges, but there's so much amount of potential as well. And what was needed was us to bring together these solutions, which that potential could be leveraged, using which that potential could be leveraged, right? So basically, we got into sustainable agriculture because we lived and worked and spent in time with the rural Indian farmer, and there are 100 million small farming families in India. And what we realized is sustainable agriculture for us is agriculture that exists 20 years from now, agriculture that exists 50 years from now, and 100 years from now. That's all it means to us. And these are livelihoods right now that are not in that direction. So the Indian small farmer's livelihood over the past 10 years has been going closer and closer to zero because of man-made climate change. Everything and man-made other activities, everything from soil erosion to water table depletion to excess heat. And every single farmer knows that without knowing the word climate change. Everybody knows that 10 years ago we were at X to now we are at half of that, and we can see in the next 20 years this is not working. So for us, that's what made us start Kheyti, is that we have to solve that problem. We have to make this small Indian farm something that lasts the next 20, 50, and 100 years, not something that goes down to zero over the next 10 years. So that's what I'm happy to talk more, but so that's sustainable agriculture for us.
Thank you, Kaushik. Scott, tell us about your path to sustainable agriculture.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. And thanks to the organizers for inviting me. This is a really phenomenal conference, and I'm really excited to speak to y'all. So I grew up in North Carolina, where hogs are king. My granddad was also a cattle rancher, so I'm pretty familiar with kind of animal agriculture. But early on, I kind of started to understand how animal agriculture is really central to a lot of the challenges of our time. So we see obviously the impact that animal agriculture has had on our environment, and in terms of carbon emissions, in terms of worsening antibiotic resistance, obviously in terms of animal welfare issues, and kind of those main issues are what spurred me to really want to pursue a career in this field. And so I studied public health during undergrad and in my master's, and kind of towards the end of that, I started looking for opportunities to make a difference within agriculture and sustainable ag. And the emerging alternative protein field really struck me as an area that I thought was likely to be really high impact. I think using market forces for good is something can be a really effective way to make a difference in the world. And I started off working at an organization called Compassion in World Farming, which is a nonprofit. But I worked with major food companies around the world to try to incorporate more plant-based items onto their menus, into their supply chains. And this was really kind of at the start of the emergence of the plant-based industry, as companies like Impossible Foods and Beyond Meat were just starting to take off. This is kind of before, Beyond Meat was on, this is before Impossible was on the menu of Burger King, before McDonald's had announced that they're going to have a plant-based lineup, and before a lot of the companies that make what's called cultivated meat or meat made from animal cells, had really taken off. But so that was kind of the start of the industry, and really loved my work at Compassion. And then I transitioned over to working at the Good Food Institute, where I currently am, where I now lead our state legislative efforts. The alternative protein industry is one that I think is growing just tremendously quickly, is a really exciting area for entrepreneurs to make a difference. And there's a lot of really interesting policy questions at the heart of that, from, what do you call these products, in terms of nomenclature, because they're innovative and they're new, and you need to be able to communicate transparently with consumers what these products are. To how do you create a safe regulatory system? So I work on a lot of different policy questions related to this emerging industry, but just tremendously excited to see the opportunity that this industry has to make a difference on a lot of the agricultural issues that we care about.
Great. So what I'm hearing from both of you is a common thread of concern about diet and about a healthy diet. But you seem to have quite different foci on the role of technology for those diets. And so, Kaushik, I'd like to start with you again to ask you about the role of technology in your startup. You have this greenhouse in a box, and let's hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So continuing that story. So before starting Kheyti, and just before I came to Columbia Business School, we talked to these 1,000 farmers, right? And we realized we talked to 1,000 farmers over 6 months in person, over the phone, doing a myriad of things, working with them. And that's where we really realized that every one of them knows the effect of climate risk and then the worsening, rate of climate change. And when we started looking at, we need to solve this problem. And, our mission became increasing climate resilient incomes for smallholder farmers. When we looked at, hey, do we need to build something new and we need to figure out what happens? We realized that that's not, all of these problems have been solved in one way or the other. There are a myriad of technologies, greenhouses being one of them, which can be used to mitigate climate change, adapt to climate change, and reverse climate change in agriculture. But the main challenge has been adoption of those technologies and how they've not been accessible, especially to the Indian small farmers. That's not even been a thing on their radar. Nobody's been looking at making them contextualized to that, for that population. So that really is our work. Our thesis is that, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. There are solutions out there, on every kind of, challenge that agriculture has, from climate change and climate risk. What we need to make them is make them work for the Indian small farmer. And that takes two pieces. One is designing for extreme affordability. So we need to convert, most of these technologies started with the, point of view of let's make them high tech. We need to make them as, affordable as possible, not as high tech as possible. So a big chunk of our work is farmer-centric design. So over the last 5 years, we've brought down the cost of greenhouses, which is basically a structure which covers your plants and helps you grow throughout the year and use lesser water, use lesser pesticide, use lesser fertilizer, and still get more yields, right? So we adapted that to the Indian small farmer and brought down the cost to 90% lower than regular greenhouses. And then, we also bundled in financing so that to make sure that it's affordable. But once we did that, it's still not useful for the Indian small farmer because they don't lack the ecosystem to make it work. That's where the second piece of technology comes in, that we need to be people who provide advice to farmers, and their information technology and mobile tech is a huge, game changer to provide those services to farmers. So our farmers interact with us on WhatsApp and learn which crops to plant in their greenhouse, how to grow in their greenhouse, where to sell their produce that comes from the greenhouse, and where to buy seeds and fertilizer. So that's our package in a nutshell. So technology is core to what we do, but it's a very different focus on technology than, let's say, how it works in a tech startup, right? It's how do we make it as affordable as possible and as contextualized as possible to the Indian small farmer for whom nobody's designed technologies before.
And just a quick follow-up on that. Do you target individual smallholders, or has there been a push to create cooperatives where several farmers or several families might invest in a greenhouse in a box?
Yeah, I mean, we work with cooperatives are the way to go in the sense that the land holdings that Indian small farmers have are not have this economics of scale. So India has made a big push to build cooperatives and farmer producer organizations and producer groups. So we work with them to reach the farmers. The greenhouses are still individual, but the farmers work in a collective to buy the seeds and fertilizer. They work in a collective to access the loans that we provide to buy the greenhouse. They work in the collective to sell their produce. So the aggregation happens at that level, not at the greenhouse level right now.
Great. And Scott, when you hear Kaushik speak about his technologies, from a policy perspective, which you've really delved into, primarily on the protein side, the animal protein side of things, do you have questions that arise as you listen to his story?
Yeah, no, I mean, Kaushik, it sounds like there's a lot of intersection between kind of our theories of change and GFI takes, I'd say, a similarly a supply side focused approach. So and technology is really at the core of kind of what we do. So when we look at our field, the emerging sector of alternative protein, we've seen over the last several decades, public health advocates, nutrition advocates, environmental advocates, animal advocates, all kind of beat the same drum around, eating a more whole food, plant-based diet. And that advocacy is great. Unfortunately, it really hasn't budged the needle in terms of what Americans are eating. And so, when we look at what we think are kind of the core primary determinants of what consumers eat, we really see taste, price, and convenience is at the heart of that. And so we're really seeking to work with companies to help create products that taste just as good as conventional animal products, are cheaper and are more accessible and more convenient to get to. So I think there's a lot of similarities, Kaushik, between our approaches. I guess I'd be interested in hearing kind of a little bit more about how you most effectively reach your folks that are going to use your product. And I imagine there's some overlap between what we do and what you do as well.
Kaushik, what do you see as overlap?
Yeah, I think the clear overlap is that I don't think that Scott and his team are in the plant-based protein business, and we are not in the greenhouse business. What we are in is the mind-changing business. Fundamentally, what that is that, and that comes through. You can call it through different means, right? You can change minds through what you call human-centered design. That's a way to change minds. You can talk about incentives, you can talk about policies, you can talk about what Scott mentioned, customizing what people want, which is if you optimize for taste, price, and I forgot the third one. I'm sorry. But that's when this thing gets adopted. But in the end, I think the real overlap is these technologies exist, the solutions exist. Let's call it solutions exist. Whether those technologies or something else, let's leave it aside. Solutions exist. We just need to find a way to get them scaled up, and getting them scaled up primarily means, behavior change. And so that behavior change can be, catalyzed by different kinds of interventions. And you probably need to use a combination of all of those, from policy to design to, customization and maybe even actual behavioral economics to solve that problem. But the solution that needs to be done in this century is how do we scale these solutions? Not really. I mean, yes, we also need to invent a lot more. But today, I think for a lot of these, we do have solutions. What we need to find is a way to get them and change minds and get them across, scaled up.
That makes a lot of sense. It sounds like maybe one difference between our approaches is that you're seeking to change behavior because there's already a solution that exists, and getting people to take up that behavior or that solution is going to be helpful. For us, they're really the field of alternative protein is so new, and they're Impossible Foods and Beyond Meat, for example, are creating something that's really new, and so we're really looking to support companies in making those new products, making them better, and putting them on the market. And we think that consumers already want to change their diets. It's just that there isn't a product that meets all their needs. And so by making that product available and like I said, cheap, competing on taste, price, and convenience, we think that will end up changing their behavior. But it's a little bit different from focusing on behavior change per se. So
one of the interesting contrasts with you panelists is that Scott works in the United States, highly developed agricultural supply chains, a huge number of opportunities for business startups. And Kaushik, you're in India, literally and figuratively. You are based in India. You work with smallholders who are very locally based. And I'd like to hear from both of you about how you see your consumers. How do you see the local component feeding into your concerns, Kaushik? And then for Scott, my question would be, how does the transnational component operate in your worldview? So we've got a primarily vegetarian, plant-based entrepreneurial effort in India, and we have animal-based in the US. And those mirror quite a bit the consumption patterns in both of those areas. So could you speak a little bit more to that, Kaushik?
I think that you're right, and it's a good observation to say it's probably sort of reflects India as well, right? Plant-based meat at some point, and one of the things in India is that it's the environmental impact of animal farming is not that big because of the because we're a poor country, and when you're poor, you don't eat as much meat as you would if you have, based on your per capita income. So I do think that's a problem that is a futuristic problem, and if Scott and others in US solve it, it's basically adaptable once we get there. But I think for us, and I'm coming from a very different perspective, and it's sort of a myopic in that sense. So for example, I don't probably understand too much about the big corporate world. What we understand is the local context. So but the consumer, talking about the consumer there, it plays a huge part in all of this, because today, even though we've started with the farmer, who is the producer, this industry works if the consumer demands it. So which is a whole different, it is sort of a context that we don't work on right now, but it's something that's very important. Today, for example, if you want our farmers to grow organic food, there's 2,000 families in all of our city of, I don't know how big our population is, but it's it's very big. But 2,000 families who buy organic food. So I think the piece that we think about the local piece that we know is the farmer, and we know there's a lot of context we're building around it. But what I think it needs to also be built in the Indian food system is that sort of advocacy in the consumer side. Consumers don't care about sustainability right now in India, and that's probably a very different context than the US.
So a follow up with Kaushik, when you talk about these greenhouses, are the crops that are being grown in the greenhouses the same that farmers would grow elsewhere? What's the diversity in what they grow inside the greenhouse? And have you noticed that there's a constant pressure towards standardization of the same seeds, for instance? Because that is a risk to the broader concept of sustainability in agriculture, to have a more and more narrowed basis for crop diversity. So,
yeah, I think there's always an economic pressure. So I think that's whether it's a greenhouse or outside, the problem is that for an Indian small farmer who's living at the edge of the poverty line, the main is the economic pressure of how do I maximize, my short-term profits, not my long-term profits. So that is always going to be a challenge, especially, for these populations, because for them, the only thing that matters is the profits. I'm saying they know at some level that they want to protect against climate change, but if you don't have, $10 in your pocket, you're only going to prioritize that. So I think that's economic pressure exists, but what we grow in the greenhouse is vegetables, and we grow a variety of vegetables. You can grow, all the vegetables that are, sort of eaten in India. Some of these farmers grow those outside as well, so it's not something completely new. But what this greenhouse does is, because you increase increase the income, and then you automatically make it a little bit more significantly more sustainable, because you use 90% lesser water. about, maybe to 90 to 100% lesser pesticides. So you can sort of remove that pesticide component if you want, and then also much lesser fertilizer. So that's the sort of sustainability that comes in. I think there's no specific pressure right now to say there's only one seed to be used, but the pressure is that to focus on yields and incomes, which is something that means that we can't, for example, take 2 years to convert that farm into organic farming, because nobody cares about it on the market side, which is the first point that I was saying, like nobody will pay a premium for organic produce, and for the farmer can't wait 2 years for return. They want the return over the next 3 months. So that's sort of a balancing act that we play, is between sustainability and, and the farmer, farmer income.
Scott?
Yeah, definitely. Well, when we think about kind of the international components of the alternative protein world, I think it's very international. I think I think the United States has been kind of the center of a lot of innovation that's happened in this sector. Obviously, like I've mentioned, Impossible and Beyond are American companies, and they're quickly exporting their products. They've started to get their foothold in the U.S., but they're increasingly looking to other economies, in particular China, to export their product to, and that's really exciting. On the cultivated meat side, making animals or making meat from animal cells. A lot of the major startups in this space as well are American. Memphis Meats, Fenless Foods, Mission Barns. These are all kind of industry leaders that are making really tremendous products. They're primarily American companies, but one of the key challenges that we see is that even though even though the United States has led the way in kind of innovation on this, can we keep up from a regulatory perspective? So to give an example of this, or to speak to kind of the innovation first before I get into some of the regulatory aspects, we see, for example, McDonald's testing out they initially tested out a Beyond Meat product in Canada, and then they announced that they were going to have introduce a line of plant-based products more generally across their franchises. They're now testing that out in a couple of Scandinavian countries to get the formulation exactly right, and then are going to expand beyond that. So there's tons of international experimentation here. But one example of how kind of regulatorily the U.S. might be lagging behind is late last year, Singapore became the first country on earth to approve a regulatory pathway for cultivated meat. So you can now sell cultivated meat in Singapore, the only country on earth, and a company called Eat Just became the first company to sell cultivated meat. They sold a cultivated meat chicken nugget to a group of high school students that are climate activists. So pretty cool messaging there. But is the U.S. going to keep up, and can the U.S. make sure that it does create a regulatory pathway to market for these products? On the cultivated side of things, at least, that's a critical question we have to face, and it's central to the industry, obviously.
So, Scott, a follow-up. One of the contrasts between your area of interest and Kaushik's is this degree of processing. So, once again, an issue of technology and also social acceptance. And so Kaushik's farmers are growing plants that will probably, and correct me if I'm wrong, Kaushik, be minimally processed before they're consumed. Whereas your area of cultured meat has faced some hesitancy by some proponents for a vegetarian diet, by being much more complex in its processing. And so from a personal perspective or from an organizational perspective, what would you like to see happen with that component, that processing component, when it comes to non-traditional meat?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I mean, so to take it kind of sector by sector, to first talk about cultivated meat. So, cultivated meat, once the U.S. creates a regulatory pathway to market, and you can, buy cultivated meat, it'll probably start out in high-end restaurants at kind of a high price point, and then work its way down from there. But that, cultivated meat down to the DNA and down to the cellular level is identical to meat made from more conventional processes. So I don't think, there's anything there in particular to worry about. on the in terms of processing on the plant-based side, I think every plant-based product is going to be a little bit different. So and different companies are going to target different market segments. So you can obviously buy plant-based products that are made of peas and carrots and that's very minimal processing. You can also buy the kind of next generation of plant-based products that are really more directly trying to mimic the taste, texture, and mouthfeel of animal products, if you'd like. And those products, I think the important thing to keep in mind is they're really after the 1/3 of Americans that eat at fast food restaurants every single week. And so, we're really after we're not, the plant-based the next generation of companies here are not trying to go after just the vegan and vegetarian market. They're really trying to reach beyond that and go for consumer share that otherwise would be eating more conventional products. And so, for consumers that want to eat a whole food plant-based diet, that's great, and that option is definitely still available. But I think it's important to keep in mind that the emerging kind of plant-based companies are creating products that offer a tremendous reduction in greenhouse gases, obviously a tremendous improvement in animal welfare, no antibiotics. And then also we think can compete on nutritional grounds as well. It's not going to be, it's not a kale salad, but it certainly does compete. So.
And thinking about the people who get involved in the sectors that in your initiatives, from Scott's perspective, a lot of it being high tech is very specialized. And so you're working with probably, you elaborate as you wish, but scientists, policymakers, it's a very high tech thing to make plant-based material quite frequently, although there are initiatives out there to say, only 5 ingredients, that's it. So there's a kind of paring down of the technology in some places. But I was wondering whether for the people who are innovators in these fields, Kaushik, in your case, people who adopt a greenhouse in a box, buy one, and the attendant services that you offer, can you characterize who those people are, who gets involved in whether it's buying a greenhouse or who gets involved in a startup for plant-based meat? Are there any kind of similarities that you see in the people who benefit from creating these initiatives? It's a sort of sociological question, I guess.
Do you want me to take that, or Kaushik?
Sure. Scott,
Sure.
You can start.
Yeah. So when we look at our consumer base, I think it's very broad. So we've seen interest in alternative proteins from just about every consumer category, every U.S. Census region. So it's not, this isn't the explosion of interest or an explosion in demand for plant-based products isn't just happening on the coasts. It's a really, really broad phenomenon, and that's really exciting to see. Obviously, the level of interest does skew a little bit younger and a little bit more in the direction of women, but it's very broad based. Like I said, every census region, pretty much every age category, all genders. So there's really interest that's very broad based. Does that answer your question, Sarah?
Yeah, sure. It's interesting to see who is adopting novelty, not only from the consumer side, but also from the innovator, the business owner side, who gets involved in these initiatives. And Kaushik, for your greenhouses, do you see that there's some sort of commonality for those who benefit from the technology?
I think for us from the farmer side, let me just giving a context of the demographics. So as I was saying, there is 100 million farmers in India. Farming families. So 400 million people dependent on agriculture in India, out of which 62% and almost 62 million families own less than a hectare of land. So that's 2.5 acres. So they own less than 2.5 acres of land. And for them, their average income from their farming and other activities per month is around $30 per month, and maybe $40. And then and then their expenses are $45. So they lose on average every month $5. And so they're basically, that's the demographic we are working with. And in that demographic, there is sort of a division of the people who's come up is this, people who adopt our technology are basically that situation for that 62 million is bad, right? So there's a big chunk of farmers who are in subsistence level, who are just focusing on surviving today, not thinking about tomorrow. And those are not the people who adopt new technologies. They need so community-based interventions to bring them up. There's also a section of farmers who are in a cynical cycle where they are right now don't have the motivation to say, I'll change my life and I'll do something new, but they're waiting and watching. Maybe there's something out there for me. Those are the people that we're focusing on, let's say, 10 years from now. The section of farmers who really work are the ones who don't, have this sense of achievement motivation. Basically, the people who know that the situation is bad, but they're willing to try whatever it happens to solve that problem. So in terms of demographics, that's what we're seeing. So it's not, ubiquitous. It's not everyone. It's basically a very subsection of those farmers that are focusing on this. On the, on the overall industry side, this is now a new thing that in India has really taken off. Agriculture and the sector of ag tech, agriculture technology has really taken off over the last 5 years. And we're seeing a lot more young people, people thinking about this as a startup or, even like, a technology startup coming into the sector over the last 5 years. Before that, it was a big challenge. Nobody wanted to work on this because everybody thought of it as a sector that it has a lot of people, but it doesn't really have a lot of innovation available. So maybe that's how it is today right now. So no, I don't see a lot of immediate overlap, but I see that it's getting there, right? Getting that there's a lot of interest getting generated right now.
So Kaushik, a follow-up. As a co-founder of a startup, would you be excited or would you be worried if another entrepreneur came along and said, hey, here is a different kind of setup of greenhouses and buy from us and not from...
I would be extremely happy. I mean, the sector needs to get made. Basically, there is no sector right now. There's no market right now. Basically, not even greenhouses. There's no market for working with small farmers and providing them technologies and making them work. So that market is 5 startups, in India, and there are 100 million, 62 million families at least that I'm talking about, right? This is like an endless pool of, market. And the market will get made by more and more of these people coming in. And you're seeing that, when there's a new startup, then people get educated, they start looking for, okay, what's the next thing I can do? And then they'll be like, oh, maybe I can take a greenhouse from Kheyti. So I think there's at least maybe 50 years to go before there is saturation or there is strong competition in the small farmer agriculture sector in India.
And a follow-up question from Scott's world of policy. Is there some sort of national policy that you would like to see? Of course, many of us have been reading about farmer protests in India, and there are multiple reasons for that protest movement. And I was wondering whether there was some sort of policy lever that would help adoption of these technologies that might reduce exposure to climate variability.
Yeah, definitely. In terms of alternative proteins, one policy recommendation that we have is for governments at every level, whether it's the federal government, state level government, or other levels, to provide funding for open access research into alternative proteins. And we primarily see that open access research funding going to universities and other entities that can conduct that research at a high level. So, when we look at other technologies, such as, the development of the renewable energy sector, when we look at the development of the iPhone, the internet, GPS, kind of any major technology, public funding has really provided a key platform for research to take place, and then for companies to really pick up that knowledge and that information and innovate from there to create a product that eventually can get into consumers' hands. So, we look at another example that we've seen in our sector is that about 10 years ago, the U.S. Department of Agriculture provided a pretty small grant to the University of Missouri. And the University of Missouri ended up conducting research into pea protein that then helped provide information for Beyond Meat as a company to form. And so, we think that public funding is critical, and we think that having the results of that research be open access is really important as well. Obviously, when companies conduct in-house proprietary research, that's great, and that really helps them advance their products and release products that consumers are going to buy. But when that knowledge can be shared openly, it really helps the sector lift itself up as a whole, and we see that as potentially being, the rising tide that can lift all boats. So, open access research funding is really one of our core policy goals.
Kaushik, so India is famous for its remarkable increase in productivity under the 1960s and 1970s Green Revolution technologies, but there has been a critique of those technologies as well. But underlying them was a building of institutions in India to help farmers increase productivity. When you think about policy that would help enable improvements in smallholder farmers, do you see that existing institutional framework helping those small farmers, or do you see your role as disruptive to come in as a company to jumpstart the productivity gains?
Yeah, I think, it's interesting you mentioned the Green Revolution, right? It took so many people, so many farmers out of subsistence farming, but obviously we never thought about, nobody even thought about during that time what it's doing to the environment of longevity of farming. And I think it's sort of, typical for our country. I think in those areas, in most of the 20th century, our focus was single variable optimization. Basically, it was like, how do we optimize one variable, which is like productivity, yield, whatever it is. And now we're in that stage where we're saying, there's sometimes interconnected variables and you have to do multiple variable optimization, right? So I think we need new kinds of institutions for that. And I don't think we are there yet. I do think there are some that are happening. Like I was mentioning, a big push in India has been, collectivization of, and a collectivization of small farmers. And that helps in so many different things and, and helps them to make decisions and get buying power. And there is hope that they'll look at multiple things and not just, sort of increasing one. I think the institutions that are the most missing, here in India are first is financing. So there's a huge amount of a lack of access to capital for small farmers, and without access to capital, they're not going to invest in new technologies. I think those institutions are not built yet, and there's a huge problem of a lack of institutions for capacity building. Even though we are doing a lot of it, but there is, or even extension, as we call it, in agriculture. So basically, the farmer does not have an institution to reach out to find out what is the new thing I should be doing, and then, and then reaching out. So that's where I think startups are coming in to say a little bit started, but it's an easy policy answer. Like, have a central database where you can, find out, what you need to do as farmers. And looking at the size of the problem of 100 million farmers, the government does have a role to play in that. So I think there's some going on, and the farm bills, which we have a lot of protests over, are an example of how it's the right direction, but done wrong way. But, but there's more institutions that need to be built before, this really scales up and, farmers are able to find access to those, their livelihood changing technologies.
Great. So I think that there's a nice connection between the two of you in thinking about the role of private innovation and public research, as well as public access to information. Charlton, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Sounds good. Yeah, so we have a Q&A function open. So if anybody out there would like to, or is wondering about something, please put it in the chat. If you see a question that's interesting to you, you can upvote it, and it'll bring it up in the queue so that we know that it's more relevant for what you want to know. So starting off with the first one, if we think about people's food purchases, as a driver for agriculture. Unfortunately, many people are required to think about cost first, i.e. fast food. How have you been working towards addressing this issue? I think, Scott, this one's very relevant for what you were talking about earlier.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. It's a great question. I mean, I think, obviously cost is really front of mind for a lot of consumers. And like I said, taste, price, and convenience, we think are kind of some of the primary determinants of what consumers buy. And so in order to kind of address understanding that that's the way that consumers see their purchases, we're trying to make sure that consumers within that framework can make the best choices for the environment, for public health, for animal welfare. And so by help supporting companies and acting as an accelerator for them and acting as a think tank for the industry more broadly, we think we can help create an industry that is going to help meet those consumer needs while allowing consumers to eat in a way that doesn't have as many of the negative, harmful effects that the current industry does.
Can I follow up and ask Scott whether the alternative meat, do they adopt farmers in a sense? Do they have a supply chain that supports small local farmers? I was thinking that Kaushik's business is predicated on the producers, on those farmers.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think, yeah. So, I mean, one thing that we've seen over the last several decades, for example, in the dairy industry, there has been a really long-term decline in terms of consumer consumption of dairy products, and that's honestly not plant-based milks are not the major factor driving that. That trend has been ongoing for decades. But in order, so it's obviously it's extremely sad to see dairies go out of business and to see dairy farmers really struggling. And to that end, there have been a couple of companies that have tried to step up to the plate on this issue. So for example, Miyoko's, which is a company that makes really high quality plant-based cheese and other dairy products, has worked with farmers to transition over to growing plant-based inputs. So instead of so if you're a dairy farmer that is looking at potential bankruptcy and not potentially being able to raise your dairy cows anymore, you can reach out to companies like Miyoko's, and there are a series of other programs that work to work with farmers and give them the capital to be able to transition over to growing inputs for plant-based products that earn more money, like pea protein, which right now is really hot and is an input in a variety of plant-based products. So I think there are a lot of really innovative tools like that are supporting farmers and smallholder farmers in particular to be able to have a role in this new industry and to earn more money.
Thank you for that. So Kaushik, I think this one's for you. A lot of people are wondering, what are your views on the ongoing protests from Indian farmers, and what are the best ways to address their concerns?
Yeah, I mean, this is a big topic. I won't go into very detail, but I'll give everyone a little bit of context, and there's a lot of nuance here. But for the context for people who don't know about this, so the Indian government passed three bills a few months back, and at the high level, there's a lot of obscurity, and what they do is they used to be, you could only sell your produce at government regulated markets. Now you can sell it anywhere. And which means like you as a buyer could only buy from farmers at government regulated markets. Now you can buy from them anywhere. And there's another piece which is gives new regulations for contract farming. Like, you can give a farmer, a new product or technology and have a contract with them for them to, earn money on that. So a lot of Indian farmers started protesting, and those protests snowballed into, there's been deaths, there's been a lot of chaos and riots, and the government first said we won't do anything about it. Then they came back and said we'll talk about it, and they said the farmers right now do not want to talk about it. They say they only want a cancellation of everything that was done, right? So that's sort of escalating every day, and we don't know where it will go. I think it's a fascinating case study in trust and trust building. And Scott, as a policy person, I think there's how not to build policies. So because at the face value, except for a few things that need to be negotiated, this is the step in the right direction. So we are at the Social Enterprise Conference in business school, and we all talk about market-based activities to solve problems. This is basically a way for markets to open up. We didn't have open markets, we now have open markets. The whole of India opened up as an open market in 1991. Agriculture was closed till now, and now they've opened it up. So that's like a sort of a good direction, right? And Professor Usher would say in his class, I like to copy it. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. This is good. It's not perfect, but it's a good direction. But the reason the protest is there is a trust deficit. It is about what would happen in the future. So none of the farmers are talking about what is there. Most of them are not talking about what is there in the bill right now. They're talking about what will happen in the future. Will the government, control, let big corporates take over and, industrialize farming and take our land away? There's nothing there that says that they will do, but they don't have the trust in the government to say they will protect us, right? And the reason is that there's almost history of 8 years of this government pushing bills onto people without having any consultation, any discussion. No policy is ever discussed with the people that is getting affected by. So that trust, I don't know if anyone has heard of this, this concept called the trust battery, but basically when we meet someone new, we start with our trust battery at 50%. And based on what they do, the trust battery goes either up or down. If they're consistent and show up for a meeting, it goes to 51%. And they do something for you, it goes to 52%. Maybe they don't come up and it goes down. And over the last 6 years, those trust battery at 0. So no one believes that the government would look out for them. And that's where this, this thing is about. Now, there are probably ways to, build that trust back up, and that's the solution. How do we address this? But it's fascinating that the level of reaction of the farmers they don't want to have a conversation. They just want this to be canceled, and then, and then we'll go home. There's no other discussion that they want to have, which is fascinating to me. So I don't know the solution, but, I gave you a little bit of the context of what is happening there from my opinion.
Yes, and it gets back to that question of who benefits and who doesn't. So Scott mentioned that a little bit in his response of who are the winners, are there losers, and what can you do to bring everybody along if that is your goal, your values. Charlton?
Thank you, both Sarah and Kaushik, on that. No, it's definitely a hot button topic right now. This one's from Claudia Canal. Scott, do you think alternative protein companies should be playing a more active role in the policy realm to accelerate progress in this area? Do you think they might be shying away from this? If so, why?
Yeah, thanks, Claudia. It's a great question. I do think the companies in this space are pretty engaged on policy issues. And one example that I'll highlight at the state level that I've spent a lot of my life for the last 2 years working on is what we call label censorship. So there have been a number of states that have introduced bills primarily pushed by the cattlemen's associations in different states and other animal agricultural associated groups that try to make it illegal, sometimes under penalty of jail time or fines. It makes it illegal to use terms like plant-based burger or veggie burger or soy milk or almond milk. And the argument that the proponents of these bills or these laws make is that those terms are confusing to consumers, and that when you call a burger a veggie burger, that consumers don't understand that is not made out of meat from an animal. And of course, that's patently ridiculous. We think it's unconstitutional. It's it violates the First Amendment. It's condescending to consumers, and there's absolutely no evidence that consumers don't understand these terms. Consumers obviously understand what soy milk is and what a veggie burger is. And it's anti-free market. These are ultimately protectionist attempts to censor an emerging industry. And the companies in the space have been very active in working with me to defeat these laws and these bills. And we've been able to do that in a large number of states. So the plant-based industry, a lot of the companies in this space are represented by the Plant-Based Foods Association. So there is a trade association that I work with pretty closely to defeat these bills. And we like I said, we've been able to defeat those bills in states like Kansas, Texas, Nebraska, Wisconsin, Washington, Maryland. So really states across the political spectrum, states really geographically diverse, some states that have really large animal agriculture presence, but ultimately did decide that label censorship is unconstitutional and anti-free market. So I think the companies in the space are pretty active, and it's been great to see their involvement.
Thanks. And so one last question. This one's for Kaushik, and is from Anchit Jain. Talking about behavioral change, how essential is contextualizing of services and products to farmers in their current mindset to win trust and drive behavioral change? For example, do you see hesitation to adopt greenhouses from individual farmers or influencing cooperatives? And how do you contextualize it to serve their capital strengths and other constraints?
Yeah, first of all, hi Anchita, even though I can't talk to you, I met Anchita a few months back, so good seeing you here. So it's essential is the answer. It is, unless we contextualize, unless we follow the principles of farmer-centric design, unless we start with listening to the farmer, this is never, they're never going to adopt a new technology, even if it's the best technology in the planet and it's available at the cheapest price. Because farmers have seen, most of their, last 10 to 15 years, their livelihoods being flat, which brings cynicism. But also, they've seen a lot of people come in with things that don't work. So farmers have been exposed to a lot of, bad products, and the meager incomes that they have been sometimes spent in these things that have not made any money for them. And so that's where it starts and it ends. All of our work is about listening to the farmer, every day, every week, every month, designing our products, in designing our processes, or even designing our connection to the farmer. So we solve that problem, of the scalability of that by working with cooperatives already. Those who have done this work already, we work with cooperatives, other NGOs, people who are working with farmers and have built that trust, over time. We solve that, but it is the thing that needs to be done. How do we solve that scalability of that challenge is secondary, but it has to be done. And at some point, there's going to be a critical mass when it becomes ubiquitous enough that farmers are going to trust this implicitly, but there's a long road to that.
Thanks. And with that, I'll pass it off to Sara to have one final question with our panelists.
I guess I would like to know whether you have optimism about managing the risks that you have identified, both in your fields. So, Scott, let's start with you.
Sure. Yeah, it's a big question. And obviously, there as with any field, there are certainly risks, and we've done our best to kind of identify what we think those are and what things could, if the alternative protein revolution was to fail, what would be the reasons for that? But I'm overall extremely optimistic about the emergence of the alternative protein industry, both on the plant-based front and the cultivated meat front. We've had just tremendous consumer demand for plant-based products. I don't expect that to stop anytime soon. We've on the cultivated front, like I mentioned, Singapore became the first country to regulate cultivated meat, and we're just, so I think regulatorily, once that opens up, I think I would expect that we'll see kind of the emergence of more companies and more products on the market on the cultivated front, which will be exciting to see. So I think there's I have honestly a very large amount of optimism in this sector. I think the key constraint is, how can we scale it up quickly? Unfortunately, food is not like an app where you can get millions of users overnight. You have to do the hard work of building a product and then building a supply chain and getting it out to consumers and building economies of scale to get the price down. So that's hard work, and it's slower than software. But I think there is just tremendous investor activity in this space that's helping that move along as quickly as possible. And for kind of entrepreneurs in the audience and folks that are interested in that, I think this is a great sector to enter. So if you have any interest in that, feel free to reach out, and I'd be excited to do my best to answer your questions.
Great. And Kaushik?
Yeah, I have immense optimism, that this is happening one way or the other. So the question is that the only question in front of us is how do we direct the energy that is in the sector so that we take care of all the multiple variables instead of solving one for one and coming back and doing a sort of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. That's the only work we have. And the optimism comes because I have been working in rural India for the last 11 years. When I left college and jumped headfirst into it, nobody else wanted to work in the sector. People call me crazy. And now everybody, every young person, okay, I'll give you an example. We just opened a fellowship program for 2 years, entry-level program. And I put a LinkedIn post and we got 1,000 applications in 10 days. So, I mean, that's the optimism that you need, And when I was 11 years ago, when I wanted to raise funds for the first startup I was working in, nobody wanted to fund these kinds of initiatives in rural India. Now we recently have in India a startup which has been given $500 million to solve the supply chain problem in agriculture, including Walmart. I mean, the only reason that's happening is that there's an energy shift that's happening. This is happening, so extremely optimistic about the growth of this. It's up to us basically to direct that energy, so that, the end point is net positive.
And I'm going to wrap up by saying that it's encouraging and optimistic for me to see this systems approach, that you are concerned about issues of equity, smallholders, but also innovators. And so thank you very much for your contributions. I think that you exemplify this willingness to reach out and make these networks that are part of that optimistic picture.
Yeah. Thank you to both our panelists and our moderator. I personally feel a lot more optimistic after that last question. And I'm going to pass it off to Diana to discuss our upcoming series in the and panels, and also the AIR Meet and how to use it to network after this.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today at the Social Enterprise Conference. We would like to encourage everyone to hop on to AIR Meet and join us for a networking hour. To do so, you just have to exit out of Zoom and click on the link in your reminder email that was sent out later yesterday afternoon or early this morning, and open that in a Google Chrome browser. And if you have a black screen, if you open it in a private browser, that'll give you access to activate your video and audio settings in order to network in our social lounge. We have a few tables open where you can join conversations with fellow attendees, turn on your microphone and video and kind of network similar to how we would in person. And if you have any issues with your technology, please feel free to email us at socialenterprise@gsb.columbia.edu, and we'll be happy to help you with your technical issues. Again, thank you so much for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing everyone later in this event series. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for calling me. And thank you, Sarah and Scott.
Thank you, Kaushik and Scott, and the organizers.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Okay, bye.